Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about Macbeth, and in particular about its context. So let's start with Shakespeare. Now, the first thing to note is that we don't actually know much about him. We think we do because his work is everywhere, his literature, his plays is everywhere and in all the language that we use. And so that kind of tricks us into thinking that we know a lot about him. But in terms of his actual biography, we don't know that much. We know that he was born in 1564 and died in 1616, and he was born in Stratford upon Avon, England. He wrote 37 plays. In fact, some people say 38 plays. So there's an example of how we don't even really know exactly how many plays he wrote. He wrote 154 sonnets, although again, there some people dispute whether he wrote those sonnets or wrote some of them. I mean, some people dispute whether he even existed, whether somebody else wrote them, but that's like a whole different topic. People have written whole books about that. We're not going to worry too much about that. We're going to just focus on the actual plays themselves. And in a way, it doesn't really matter who wrote them. Let's just say that we are talking about the person who wrote those plays. And he wrote two long poems. And he's regarded by most people as being the greatest writer ever. Certainly, almost everyone would agree that he was certainly a great writer, if not the greatest. So he's married to Anne Hathaway. They had three children, and one of them died as a child. His name was Hamnet, and Shakespeare wrote a famous, another, well, all his plays are famous, but he wrote a very famous play called Hamlet, which actually many people think is the greatest play, the greatest book ever written. And clearly that was possibly named after Hamlet. And Hamlet is a very dark, sad play, which kind of makes sense given that it was written after his child's death. His marriage to Anne Hathaway, we don't know much about it, but they lived quite far apart from most of the time. So there's a theory that they didn't really have much of a marriage. She was much older than him. Anyway, again, we won't worry too much about that. Now, Shakespeare is very interesting because, well, for all kinds of reasons, but one reason is that he straddled, which means kind of crossed, two time periods. The Elizabethan era, so era means time period, so that was from 1558 to 1603, and the Jacobean era, which was between 1603 and 1625. In fact, if we consider just the plays, they are almost literally equally spread out over the two time periods, about 10 years each. So from about 1593 to 1613. Now, both dates are approximate. So his first play was actually probably written in 1590, but again, we don't know for sure. So I've kind of jiggled these dates a little bit just to suit my argument, but only by 1 or 2 years. And finally, if you have trouble remembering when Shakespeare lived, the easiest date to remember is 1600. Okay, so it's about 400 years ago and almost exactly in the middle of his writing period. So students, if you ask them when was Shakespeare, they don't really know, um, partly because the dates are quite complicated. But if you want an easy way of remembering, just think about the year 1600, okay? Because as you can see there, it was roughly around that time. And in particular, if you look at these dates here, 1600 is almost exactly in the middle of when he was writing. Okay, so now let's have a look at the two periods, Elizabethan era. So this was named after Queen Elizabeth I, and it's often considered the golden age of England. because it was a time of immense progress, stability, and national pride. So during Elizabeth's reign, England flourished politically and economically. The country also began extending its reach to the New World, which is America, solidifying its status as a world power. Protestant England became more unified than ever after the defeat of the Catholic Spanish Armada in 1588. And the period is also considered one of the most prolific means a lot, eras of the English Renaissance, which saw an outpouring of poetry and drama, most notably that of William Shakespeare. Now, the Renaissance actually started in Italy, in Florence. You can't give exact dates for any of these things, but somewhere around 1300, 1400, definitely by 1500, it was in full swing. But then it kind of spread, and each country had its own Renaissance. So this was certainly the time when the English Renaissance was happening, and William Shakespeare was obviously at the heart of that, certainly in terms of literature. In other areas like science, Newton, yeah, and other scientists were doing their thing in science, and there were painters and artists. But in terms of literature, obviously Shakespeare is kind of like the main name that stands out. And then the Elizabethan era significantly shaped the future of England and culminated in the dawn of the British Empire. Okay, so let's move on now to the Jacobean era. So it's named after James the First of England, who was James the Sixth of Scotland. And it's called Jacobean rather than Jamesian because Jacobus is the Latin version of the name James. So when Elizabeth the First died, uh, England, this led to a lot of instability. Elizabeth the First had been around for a long time, and in fact, as she got older, people started to realize that she was going to die soon. There was a lot of anxiety around, and one of the reasons for the anxiety was that she didn't have an heir, a successor. She didn't have a son. So that was actually one of the reasons why King James the Sixth of Scotland was kind of called in to become King of England. But this was not universally popular. And you can see that from the fact that he was the target of the gunpowder plot in 1605. So Guy Fawkes was the leader, and Guy Fawkes, the fireworks that we have on November the 5th, that's all in memory of that event. So they tried to blow up the House of Parliament and King James. And you might think, well, why do we celebrate that? Well, I mean, the celebration is the fact that the plot failed. Now, he commissioned the first authorized version of the Bible. So it's called the King James's Authorized Bible. Well, it has different names, but something like that. And he was really interested in the supernatural and even wrote a book about the subject called Demonology. So that's the original spelling, which can be a bit tricky. So if it makes your life easier to remember this spelling, then you can do that. So the Jacobean era is also characterized by flourishing of the arts and literature in the same way as the previous Elizabethan era was. But there were subtle changes. And the main difference between, in terms of literature, is that Jacobean literature is much darker, mainly because it was a much more unstable time. And obviously, Macbeth is a classic example of that. Okay, so let's come on to the actual play itself. So there's a picture summary of the play. Uh, you can just have a look at those pictures, they're quite interesting. But then in terms of, and then here's another kind of picture version of the plot summary. I'm going to go through the words in a minute, but this one is quite interesting and useful to look at because there's a little bit of humor in there in the use of the words. So this is not my picture. I found it on the internet. It looked quite useful. So three witches tell Macbeth he will become king. Macbeth tells Lady Macbeth he will become king. Lady Macbeth tells Macbeth to kill the king. Macbeth kills the king. You can see the attempt at humor here. It is quite funny. Macbeth becomes king. Now there's a slight change here. Macbeth has his friend Banquo murdered. Macbeth gets more prophecies from the witches. Macbeth kills the family of Macduff, Thane of Fife. Macduff joins up with Malcolm, son of the dead king. Go back to the word king. Lady Macbeth goes mad and dies. Macduff and Malcolm dress up like trees and attack Macbeth. Macduff kills Macbeth. Okay, so in words, the play is set in Scotland about 1050 AD. We don't actually know when it's set, but if you look at the history, it's probably more like 1040 AD actually, but I've rounded it to 1050 to make your life a bit easier. It doesn't matter, you don't need to know the exact date. And it is loosely based on historical events. And Shakespeare did this quite often. He based his plays on historical events, sometimes even on stories that he literally not copied exactly, but he would take existing stories and just make them his own in his masterful way. Actually, Shakespeare shows that plots quite often are not the most interesting thing. It's how you tell the stories, how you use language. So the reason we admire Shakespeare so much is not because he came up with original plots or stories. He didn't often, but it's the way he told them. It's his use of language. He's just a master of language to such an extent that you almost, if you didn't know it was written by a person, you would think it was almost supernatural, really. So it's about this Scottish chief and soldier, Macbeth, who kills the king, Duncan, in order to become king himself. So Macbeth does this because he's obsessed with power and ambition. And that's the main theme of the poem, really, as we'll see later on. And he's helped and manipulated into doing it by his wife, Lady Macbeth, who is a very unusual Jacobean woman because she's strong and ruthless. So one of the themes of the play is gender roles and this idea that men were supposed to be men and women were women. You know, men were masculine and strong and brave, and women were like this strong, soft and gentle. I mean, that's probably never actually 100% true. We're just talking about how women are presented in public. In the house, things can be completely different, can't they? We all know stories of where the women are in charge of the house. And there's the old saying, the woman wears the trousers in the house. And in fact, if we look at Queen Elizabeth herself, we can see that actually Lady Macbeth is not that unusual because Queen Elizabeth I was also very strong, and she could also be very ruthless when she had to be. So the play is about the consequences of killing the king, which is called regicide. The word regicide means to murder the king. So murder is obviously a terrible thing in itself, but to murder the king, especially back then, was considered to be the greatest sin of all, because the king was supposed to be God's representative on earth. So you're almost killing God by killing his representative. And this idea that he's the God's representative is called the divine right of kings. So the word divine means to do with God. And the play is also about hamartia, a concept from ancient Greek dramatic theory, in which a fatal flaw in a character leads to their downfall and death. So it's therefore a tragedy in the technical sense of the word, as opposed to just something terrible that happens. So most words in English have more than one meaning, and the word tragedy normally means something terrible has happened, people have died. But it has a technical meaning in literature, which is to do with this hamartia. I mean, it still leads to death, but it has this technical meaning. Actually, the word hamartia is just one word of a whole kind of series, an arc of words from Greek dramatic theory. I'm not going to go into that in this video. I mean, even if just knowing this word and talking about it in your essays will get you up to those higher grades of like 7 and above. And even to get grade 8 or 9, you don't need the other words. But if you want to research those yourself, for those people who are aiming for the really top grades, by all means do so. But I personally don't think it's really necessary. But this word hamartia is very, very important. Okay, so let's move on to the characters in pictures, and then we'll go through the words in a minute. So there we've got Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, Duncan, King of Scotland. The Banquo is his friend, best friend, you could say, in many ways. Um, and they are both soldiers and generals. We've got three witches who are very critical. They make various predictions that lead to the story kind of unfolding. Macduff, Thane of Fife. So Thane, it means a chief, a Scottish chief. He's not main a character, but he's quite important because he actually kills Macbeth in the end. And then Malcolm, Duncan's son, and his heir, his successor to the throne. Again, not a main character, but clearly important because he's Duncan's son and heir to his throne. So he kind of stands in the way of Macbeth becoming king. So if we just look at it in words, so Macbeth is obviously the main character, the protagonist, which means main character. Lady Macbeth, his wife. Banquo, his best friend and a fellow soldier. We have King Duncan, who is killed by Macbeth. We've got three witches who make various predictions. We've got three apparitions who only appear once, actually, but they are really, really important. We'll get to those when we learn the actual play. And then we have the secondary and minor characters. So these words, secondary and minor, if you read kind of literary theory about different types of characters, they are defined in different ways. But anyway, so Malcolm, King Duncan's eldest son. So I mentioned earlier that he's not main character, but he is important. Now, Fleance is Banquo's young son, so he's not important in that he's not a main character. But Macbeth, at one point in the play, kills his own best friend Banquo and tries to kill Fleance, but Fleance escapes, and that's important to the plot and the story. So we'll get to that. So in that sense, Fleance is quite important. Macduff, a chief who kills Macbeth at the end of the play, so I mentioned that earlier as well. And then Lady Macduff and her children, so his wife. So again, they're not main characters as such, but they are murdered on Macbeth's orders. And that's important in the sense that it shows how Macbeth becomes more and more violent and bloodthirsty. And then we have the minor characters. So Donalbain is Duncan's younger son. He doesn't really play much of a role. Lennox, Angus, Ross are chiefs, and they come on the stage at various points. They're not important characters, but they kind of connect the scenes together. And the murderers who kill Lady Macduff and her children here. And there's one scene called the Porter scene. Now, it's quite a famous scene. It's quite funny. It's not really important at GCSE level. I really wouldn't get bogged down with it. I wouldn't worry about it. Um, but it's a funny scene. And Shakespeare sometimes has these scenes, and there are various reasons why he or any playwright might have such scenes. So sometimes it's to kind of, especially in a tragedy, in a dark story, you want a little bit of light relief sometimes. So that's why this scene is quite funny. But also, you sometimes need scenes which give the main characters a rest, a break, or to change costumes. Okay, so that's that scene there, or that character there. Okay, now coming to the themes. Uh, it says picture version here. Actually, you've got both. So you've got the pictures. So this is from the internet, and this is what I wrote down. So I wrote these just from my mind, and you can see that there is some match. So power, ambition, and guilt. Okay, so we've got power uh, and ambition. We've got kingship and the divine right of kings. Actually, that's not even there. That should really be there. The great chain of being, that's not there. We'll talk about that later. Appearance and reality, so versions of reality. Gender roles, we've got gender there. And the supernatural, that's not there. But this one's got fate and free will, which I haven't got. Violence, time. So the point here is that Macbeth is a very complex play. In fact, all of Shakespeare's plays are very, very complex, and they are unusual in that they're studied from primary school all the way up to university. People do PhDs on Shakespeare plays, but they're also studied at primary school. So it's very strange, isn't it? But there's an important point here, which is that depending on the level you're studying the play at, you mustn't get bogged down in too much detail. At primary level, quite often it's just one scene. At key stage three level, you might look at the whole play, but probably just pick out a few key scenes. GCSE is the first time you would be expected to kind of read the whole play, but at GCSE level, you really don't need to worry about understanding every single line and word. And in fact, you shouldn't do that. You don't have time for that. Okay. So this is where a good teacher comes into it, and hopefully I come into it, and these videos come into it. But your teachers and your school, it's important to know what to focus on and not get too bogged down in too much detail. So power, ambition, and guilt, that's fairly straightforward, but we'll learn those more as we go along. Kingship and the divine right of kings, we talked about earlier, that the king is the God's representative on earth. So the great chain of being kind of links to that. So the idea was that there's God obviously at the top, and then his representative, the king, and then you've got the aristocracy, the royal people, and then the upper classes and the middle classes and the working classes and so on. So the idea was that everybody should stick to their place, okay, and especially not to kill the king and not to go against the people at the top. Obviously, looking back now, or even nowadays, this does exist, and probably you can say is that people at the top really who want to impose this on the people below. And as history goes on, people at the bottom are kind of fighting back. Anyway, that's maybe going a bit too much detail at the moment. And then appearance and reality is a fancy kind of term for that what you see is not always what you get. You can't judge a book by its cover. You can't tell from how somebody looks to what they're really like underneath. They might look really nice and friendly, and they turn out to be really nasty. Or vice versa. Sometimes you meet people who are very quiet and seem to be quite unfriendly, don't seem to be that bothered. But then as you get to know them, you realize that they're actually quite nice and helpful. Okay? So gender roles, we've mentioned about the idea that men were meant to be strong and brave, women were meant to be weak and gentle, certainly in public. In private, like I say, that's probably never been the case, but we're talking about in public. And then the supernatural. So people believed in the supernatural in those days. We mentioned that King James himself, he really, really believed in it. And he wrote a whole book about it. And certainly that may have influenced Macbeth or influenced Shakespeare in the sense that he includes the supernatural is a big, big part of the play, the witches and the predictions and so on. Okay, so that is an overview and of the play and the context. So to make sure that you've been listening, here are some questions. So at this point, you should pause the video and try and answer these questions. If you can't answer them easily from your mind, then you need to go back and listen to the video again. And that's the whole beauty of a video. You can go through as many times as you like. You can pause it. So please pause the video because I'm now going to move on to the next slide where the answers are. Okay. But you really, really need to try and answer these questions before you look at the questions, the answers. So I'm moving on now. So there are the answers. Check your work. if you hopefully you're aiming to get everything correct, okay, 100% correct if possible. Always aim for 100%. And then if you get 90 or 80 or 70, that's fine. Anything less than 50% means you really haven't tried very hard, okay? So check your answers, and if you got less than 50%, certainly you need to go back, try and aim for that 70, 80% or more if you can. Okay, so that's Macbeth overview and context. I hope you enjoyed that video, and it's really important to have a really good understanding of this. Otherwise, when you study the play in the upcoming videos, it won't make as much sense as it could.